you have to understand that you are not going to perform well if there's something that makes you uncomfortable. So you have to think, okay, instead of thinking, oh, I'm nervous, how can I work around that using techniques and other little tricks to hide the nerves or whatever. You have to try and understand, what is it that's making me nervous? Is it that I'm too far away from the audience? Is it that I'm too close? Is it that there's a table in a way, or that there isn't a table? Or is it that I'm worried about things breaking? And then when you've figured out what it is that's worrying you, you take that worry away, and then you feel relaxed.
Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Don't forget to follow Instagram account to see the stories behind the scenes, and also subscribe the YouTube channel to see the live talks. Let's get in touch on LinkedIn, share your reflections with us, with Urbanistica community. Recommend the podcast to people you think are interested in urbanistica topics. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. I'm really excited for this episode. I have the pleasure to welcome Andrew Hennigan one more time to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, and thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much. So how are you doing?
Doing very well. It's interesting times. There's a lot of speaking opportunities, both live and virtual. And there's also a lot of new challenges in coaching, especially coaching for virtual events, which is something that didn't really exist a year ago.
Yeah, and now we're recording this episode in September. So how was your summer?
It was very peaceful, very quiet, without traveling very far. We just went to Småland, where we have a house, and it was extremely quiet there. And there wasn't really any troubles with coronavirus, because we're in a place in the forest where there aren't any people nearby. So distancing only becomes an issue when you go to the supermarket. So.
Yeah, great. So, Andrea, you were a great guest and very inspiring in the very early beginning of this podcast. I'm very happy to have you one more time here. Now we got 17,000 listeners from 100 countries. I would love to ask you, how would you like to introduce yourself one more time, and please tell us, what are you passionate about?
Okay, the usual way that I introduce myself is to say that I do mainly three things. I am myself a speaker. I do lectures, workshops, any kind of thing like that. I also coach and mentor other speakers. And I'm still, like from the very beginning, a writer. I've started off my career as a writer, and I still do some of that. Though today it's mostly ghostwriting for other people, though I do occasionally work on my own books, and sometimes I do some freelance journalism when somebody asks me to do it. What am I passionate about? Well, I've been thinking about that this morning, and I realized that what I'm passionate about really is learning new things. So maybe I'm passionate about one thing, but then I discovered that there's another new thing, and I want to learn about that. And as soon as I master one field, then I want to discover new ones. And I've realized now that behind every curve, there is always another curve. So there's always something unexpected coming. And I do now things that I never knew existed a few years ago. And I'm sure that in the future, I'll be doing other things I cannot imagine today. And that's what makes life so exciting. You're not always doing the same thing, but looking at new things. It's like what happened in speaking, where my first concern was just to speak without falling over, just to be not afraid. Past that, then I wanted to be very effective and memorable. Then when you get past that, you have to develop techniques for being able to do that, but with little time and little effort. And then when you get that, then you think, oh, I want to be much more authentic and natural. And then there's more coming just around the next corner. So it never ends. And this is my passion, is learning new things, discovering new things, and discovering that there are more things to discover.
Yeah, very interesting journey. And I'm really curious to know, when did everything started? Like your passion about writing, learning things, and also coaching in public speaking.
Strangely enough, I know exactly when this happened, because it happened when I was extremely small, single figure age. I don't remember the exact year. And one of the things I loved to do was to make my own newspapers. I would take a big piece of paper, draw some columns, and make up my own stories and draw the pictures and everything. Then years later, of course, I got more fascinated with writing. And I even considered at one point working in journalism. And then I discovered that the dark side, PR, pays a lot better than journalism. So I went that way instead. So then I ended up writing for a living. And one of the things I ended up writing was other people's speeches. But then I would see that I would write a beautiful speech, but the speaker would deliver it very badly. So then I added to my repertoire the coaching part, telling people how to deliver it. But then I discovered that people would take my beautifully written speech, deliver it exactly as I said, and it would still not work because they had not understood the situation. They didn't realize that persuading people isn't a matter of just showing them some slides. It's much more complicated. So then I expanded into influencing and persuasion. So we started adding new skills like networking, strategizing, how to build a consensus for your ideas and so on. Then it becomes much more complicated. And I ended up teaching that in companies and in business schools and later also in universities. And that got me also interested much more in speaking myself. So in the beginning, I got a lot of speaking experience through teaching, mostly to business students and leaders and so on. But then that expanded into other fields as well. So, and that's how I ended up being active in all three fields, the speaking part myself, which I love, the coaching and mentoring, which I find very, very interesting and challenging, and then the writing too, where sometimes I still write people's speeches for them. So it all began with a small child with a little pen, just drawing his own newspapers just for fun. And I didn't realize that at the time. I only discovered that later when one of these newspapers, which was preserved, ended up in my collection. So, and that reminded me where it all started.
Very, very interesting journey. So you're developing your own toolbox.
Yes.
Of different services and also coaching. So I think this is going to be a great combination because today we're going to talk about spaces for speaking. And you're the expert when it comes to speaking. And I would love to know from you, how do you define a space?
There are actually two separate kinds of spaces. The one I'm most interested in is the actual physical space and the equipment around the speaker. So I'm hired to speak at an event. Like this week, I went to Malmö. I stand at the front of the room and I look around and I try to think, is this going to work or do I need to change things? And so I'm worried about my space where I'm working. This is fairly normal. But there is another interpretation as well, and that is in this sort of organizational sense that people, if they're going to learn how to speak, they have to practice speaking, which means they need to have opportunities to speak or spaces. So they need kind of a space for speaking, just like a musician needs a space for performing. And if you want to have big bands in a stadium 10 years from now, you have to have pubs and clubs where they can start playing already and getting experience. You wouldn't have had big bands on the big stages without the small clubs where people were learning their craft and practicing live performing. It's the same with speakers. If an organization wants people to be good at speaking, they have to provide spaces where they can actually do this. So some companies, some government ministries, some organizations, they have their own internal sort of conferences where you can speak, or they encourage employees to speak at lunchtime. There's a lot of companies do that. And one of the goals of that is just to provide people with a space where they can develop interesting content and have an audience for it. Because without that organizational space, it's very hard. In theory, I could just rent a theater and stand there and speak, but people won't come if there isn't a framework around it, either a company organized event or some organization which is organizing something, or a framework like TEDx or MOF or something like that. So there is a reason for people to come. And I think this is very important, this concept of the organizational space for speakers, and it's important for their development. I think that every organization should have a plan for that. But my main interest as a speaker and as a coach is in the actual spaces where speakers speak, because what I've discovered over the years is that a lot of problems that speakers have are actually caused by the way they're using the space, and that you can actually improve the performance a lot without the speaker changing anything. So you often find me maybe backstage at the event talking to the sound engineers, trying to fix a problem with the sound so that the speaker isn't stressed by that. Or I'm quietly moving away lights, or in one case, I'm in the kitchen trying to negotiate a pause in the kitchen work so there'll be no noise coming down the corridor, which could distract the speaker. Because all of these things stop you speaking effectively. Now, somebody who's very, very confident can speak through a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever and not care. Most people are not that confident, and little niggling problems like a headset that doesn't fit properly, or a light that's just dazzling a little bit, or a noisy air conditioner, lots of little things can cause a problem. And just by working on the space, you can make things a lot easier for people.
Yeah. Tell me about the physical space. How
Yeah.
do we adapt it so it fits to a...
This is actually very interesting because there is no single kind of space style which works for everybody. Now, the ideal, let's assume you had the perfect robot speaker that had no limitations, no nerves, no fears, and plenty of experience. The ideal situation is a completely blank stage, TED style, which is why TED does that with the little red carpet to keep you in where the camera is looking. The ideal situation is a completely blank stage because then you have nothing between you and the audience. There's no barriers, so the communication is better, the bond is better, the trust is better, the speaker is more credible. But there's a catch. Millions of years ago, our ancestors were little furry guys running around in the forest, and if one of those ran into a big clearing and started making a lot of noise, they would get eaten. So the ones who survived were the ones who liked hiding behind trees. And we still have that wired in our brains, so that for most people, walking out onto a big empty stage is terrifying. So a lot of people, they need something else. Some people like to have at least a table nearby for comfort, even if they don't touch it. Some people like to actually be touching the table, but at the side, and some people have to be behind the table. And in the worst sort of extreme, they're the people who grip the table like they're afraid it's going to run away. And the table never runs away, believe me. So you can't necessarily say, okay, the ideal situation is you stand exactly here, you have nothing in your hand, nothing on the table, no table, because that would maybe give you the best results with a very, very well-trained speaker. But with most people, that's just going to make them nervous. And it's more important that the speaker be calm than they be perfect. A calm speaker who's breaking some rules is better than one who is keeping to my rules, but maybe is a lot more nervous. So I am a bit flexible. If somebody wants a table, I say, okay, you can have a table, except at TED, where we have months to work on that problem. So it's never an issue, or at least normally never an issue. If somebody wants to stand behind it, maybe I try to convince them to stand beside the table instead. But if they really, really are too terrified, I say, okay, we just let it drop. But there's some things where it's not worth making a big fight, because then you end up with a speaker who's very nervous, and a speaker who is nervous is not one who can work. So you have to try and find out, how are you comfortable on the stage? Do you want to have the notes in your hand? Do you want to have something? And there's a lot of things you can do, like you provide a table at the right height. So if you have an adjustable table, that's ideal. But we have at Impact Hub now, we have some really cool stage tables which have got a battery-powered electric motor. So there's no cables, but you can press a button and they go up and down. That, I think, is really ideal. Most stage tables are not like that, but at least there is one. But you have to be able to adapt, which means that some people who come will be like me. My dream is just to clear the whole area and have a big, big space where I can walk around and stand and talk. For a lot of people, though, that's very intimidating. They want a table where they can put a computer or notes or something else. So you have to really make it flexible enough to adapt to everybody's style, which means that you should not have a bench that's screwed to the floor. This is the worst case scenario. There is a big company near Stockholm, and on their campus, they have a beautiful meeting room, a big amphitheater, with theatre seating, a big stage and everything, but there's a big bench, university style, screwed to the floor, and they expect you to sit behind that with your little microphone like a United Nations event. But of course I don't. I'm not going to sit behind it, and there's no room to stand behind it, and there's no room to stand in front. So this beautiful room, which cost a fortune, is more or less useless from a speaker's perspective. It can only work in a very limited situation where you have maybe the academic who sits at the table and reads from some notes. That's the only context in which that room will really work effectively. But normally you would expect to have a completely blank space. You would need to provide tables of different heights, like, for example, it's very bad to turn around and look back at the screen. That always breaks the concentration, so I'm always telling people never look back, always have a monitor. Now, if you go to the Aula Medica at Karolinska or other big venues, there is a screen in front of you on the floor. You can simulate that by putting a laptop on the floor. I often do that. Or you put it on a small stool or a small table or something. So it's good to have a few different sort of height and size tables. So my preferred setup would be I'm facing the audience in a big empty space on the floor, far in front of me as far as I can. I have my laptop. so that when I click the slide, I can see that it changed. But I'm not trying to read it because I know it already, so I don't need to. But it's down there. Somebody else might want it a little bit closer so that they can look to remind themselves of the words sometimes. So that sort of is the ideal setup. Occasionally you find a natural sort of monitor, like for example, I've been in meeting rooms where there's a glass wall opposite the speaker and you can see the screen reflected in the window, which is really cool because then you don't ever need to turn around. You don't need a monitor in front of you and so on. So the big secret of having an effective speaking space is, first of all, to make sure it's big enough for people to walk around. This is something I think that people often underestimate. I went to visit a customer once to do some coaching of senior managers. And as soon as I arrived in a room, I stood in the speaking space in their own boardroom. And I said, okay, one of the reasons why it's so hard to speak here is because I can hardly breathe. The table is so close to the wall. I said, next time you build a new meeting room, please leave a lot more space. And then, of course, they face-palmed and said, we've just spent a fortune redoing this room. And they left a huge space for sandwiches at the other end, but no space for speakers. And so I said, okay, next time, leave more room for the speakers than the sandwiches because that's more important. And they were making it hard for themselves. So you need a big space. You need flexible furnishings that you can move. You need also sources of power. The cable for the projector, if you have one, or the screen, they have to be long enough to reach where you want to be. Because I've also been in a lot of rooms where the only way you can plug in the computer is to put it in a corner behind you, which means you can never see what's on the screen. I want to be able to put it on the floor. This problem is getting a lot less now because you can share the screen in a lot of places, and you can use your phone and then just share the screen to the big screen. So it's not as bad as it used to be, but that's helping. It also helps if you have a little bit of care about the lighting, which means that if you have a projection screen, you don't want to have bright lighting next to the screen for obvious reasons. But at the same time, you need to have light on the person who's speaking. This is very important if you expect anybody to share content to social media, because I see a lot of pictures where you see a very bright screen and the speaker is completely in darkness, which means that they're not really good pictures for sharing. So a couple of cheap LED spotlights make a big difference. And you can improve a lot of meeting rooms just by adding a couple of spotlights and either replacing the projector with a big screen TV, or you get one of those short throw projectors that projects downwards, which means that the projector can be behind you. And that's very important in rooms where the ceiling is low, because the other big danger is you have a projector in front of the screen and the speaker has to stand in front of that with the light from the projector on their face, which looks terrible. So that's a kind of basic space. I want it to be big. I want it to be flexible so that people can adapt to their style. So you will have some people who will say, I cannot speak without the table in front of me. And so you give them the table, and then you get other people like me who say, let's clear everything away. And I do that usually, and then make sure also there's other little things like boxes, tables, at various heights. It's not very difficult to arrange that. Or you get one of those new electric tables that goes up and down, so it can go down to monitor height or be up to leaning height, though you shouldn't actually lean. You can maybe rest your hand gently on the table or on the lectern, but you should never really put any weight on it in case it slips. And also because it doesn't look good if you're leaning. I mean, leaning on things is what you do in a bar, but it's not what you do speaking. You should be able to stand up on your own legs if you can. If you can't because you have a problem, well, that's a different thing. This is a problem of accessibility. And I think it's very important as well that it should be possible for people to speak regardless of how they feel. I mean, I've done lectures with a knee injury, and I've done a whole workshop just after an operation, and it's doable, but it's a struggle. And I don't think anybody should be forced to struggle. I think that if you want to hear everybody's opinion, it should be possible for everybody to just get up and speak, which means if you have a platform, there must be a ramp. It means that there must be the possibility of having a table and a chair if necessary, because I know a lot of people will stand up for the speaking because it's important, but there are some people who literally can't. So you have to provide an alternative and make sure that that's easy to arrange, something very simple and straightforward. Otherwise, you're always going to get the same people who speak. And if you do have steps going up onto stage, at the very least, you have to have a handrail, but preferably there should be some kind of ramp or no step at all, which is because you don't really need to look down on people. This, I think, is only necessary in very large.
Yeah. It's a really great recipe of the
different design elements that we can have a kind of perfect stage for speaking. Tell me more. Is spaces only for speakers, or how is it from the other side of the story, the audience?
It depends a lot. The whole space actually is very important, because how you arrange the furnishings also for the audience conditions the kind of event you get. So, for example, if I go into a room and the speaker is at the front and the tables and chairs are laid out like in a sort of theatre kind of alignment, what that's telling me is you're going to listen, but we don't want to hear what you think. So it's a one-way communication. I will just speak at you. If I find that they have a different room layout, like maybe a horseshoe, I would expect there to be a lot more interaction, and that encourages interaction. Or if you want there to be more interaction between the audience, then you would have little island tables. That way they can interact with each other very well, and a bit less with the speaker, which is fine, because there's some workshops where the speaker is really a facilitator, but it's the audience who do all the talking. So the way you lay the room out conditions the way you're going to get the kind of space activity you're going to get. So again, the audience seating has to be flexible. There has to be things you can move around, not screwed to the floor. And there should be possibility to plug into power sources which are on the walls around the outside. So not a table with all the connections, which is then wired into the floor, so it can't be moved at all. And there should also be enough space for walking around, because I've also tried to do workshops in spaces where you literally could not get behind the chairs because the table was too big for the room. Some people get a boardroom that's maybe 10 meters by 4 meters, and then they buy a table that's 9 by 3, and it doesn't work. You can almost not get out when you get up, and that's very, very dysfunctional. You need to leave spaces for people to walk around. And for the kind of interactive sort of events and workshops, you really need a very large space. And the ideal for me is that a very big room with maybe a horseshoe at one side and island tables on the other. So you can bring everybody to the horseshoe, introduce a new concept, then they go to the island tables to do some exercises. And this movement also is good for them. Right? They get up, move around, it keeps them awake. And I've worked in places where they had that kind of double room. It's a bit more expensive, but it's very, very effective. And you have to consider, should we save on the room and furnishings, or should we sacrifice instead more of our budget to give a better result? Because if you do save money on the meeting room, then for many years you're condemning people to less effective meetings, which then slows down all the other activities, which is really, really not ideal at all. In terms of which places I like, it depends really on what kind of event it is, because as a speaker, I really like big, open, empty stages like the Karolinska Aula Medica. I think that's really awesome, but it's not ideal if you want to have a very intimate, interactive experience with the audience. In that case, then you should really be down at the same level, not high up on the stage. And it helps maybe if nobody is very far away, and it helps also perhaps if you don't need a microphone, so a very, very small, intimate space. But it depends on what you're trying to do. Like there's some lectures where it's fine to be in a very large venue. There's other things though where I'd prefer to be in a cozy meeting room somewhere, and it doesn't really matter. But there are a lot of other factors, like the ceiling height determines also the kind of meeting you get. Like if you've got a very low ceiling, it's obviously a much more sort of private, cozy, intimate thing. When you've got a high cathedral ceiling, it's more of an event, and that's actually better from a lighting point of view, but it does tend to make people feel like they're very exposed and very out in the open.
Yeah. Now we talked about the stage, the audience. Tell me about the facilities around. What are the very important facilities to have both for speakers and the audience?
Well, I think that the first thing to do is to make sure that everything works, because what's frustrating is to get to a place and the technology doesn't work. But apart from that, I think that nowadays, most places I go to, they either have a modern projector or they have a big screen. The ideal is a big screen because you can walk in front of it without getting light on your face. So a big screen like at the Hotel at 6 is sort of like the ideal for a speaker. Having said that, you also need to be very flexible though in where you can put the monitors. You need to be flexible in the kind of screens you have or no screens. There has to be also a way of getting a microphone into the audience. If it's a large space, you need to have throw microphones or some other arrangements so that they can interact as well. But I think that having lots of space though for everybody, for the audience, for the people is really important, because if they're really cramped, even before the pandemic, that was very stressful. But I think that nowadays people are going to like that even less, to be really squashed together all the time. So you need to have wider lobby spaces, make it easier to get in and out, plenty of capacity for the food serving and things like that. But apart from that, I think it's good to have refreshments. Obviously, the water and the coffee are the two essentials. You must have clear signs everywhere telling how to connect to the network, because otherwise you will really frustrate people who can't get connected. And you have to have the right equipment for the audience, which means ideally having both all the kind of cables for plugging in stuff and all the screencasting tools as well, so that you can just connect any device. I'm increasingly now looking at the idea of using my phone instead of a laptop, when then I have less to carry. So I can have the presentations on my phone and I can screencast those directly to big TVs, which saves a lot of messing about. And then you just swipe the screen to change the slide. And if you add a Bluetooth clicker, you can also then have just your smartphone, a Bluetooth clicker, and then you screencast to the screen. That, I think, is the ideal setup, and that's what I would like to have. And in places where I can influence the layout of the room and the equipment, that's what I ask for. That and the ideal lighting as well, which I think is usually not done right. You have to consider also the lighting for the audience too, because if you're in like a theater watching a play, your expectation is to be in darkness. If you're in a meeting, you might want to be taking notes or something else. You might want to have a little bit of light. So there has to be a trade-off there between how much light do you want on the audience. Do you want the audience to be just in total darkness, or are you going to give them light to work on, and things like that?
Yeah. And if we talk more luxury facilities, like
Yes.
a restroom for speakers with yoga or a bathroom, what do you think?
I think that it's good to have a green room for speakers. I think that's very helpful, because there are some people who can just walk in off the street and they're very well prepared and they can speak without a lot of relaxation. But there are a lot of other speakers who are very nervous, and having a space at the back where they can be on their own is very, very important. You find the same actually also in the music business. There are some people who are very tense before a performance. And I remember once going to meet a friend who was doing a concert, and she warned me before I went in. She said, if you see the pianist backstage, don't say anything until after the show, because he gets very, very nervous and he doesn't want to be distracted, because he's running through the whole concert in his head and doesn't want to be annoyed at all. And I think most speakers are like that. So if you want your speaker to be happy, you provide them with a room where they can just be isolated. So no questions about the holidays and things like that. You just leave them be on their own, because they're probably practicing one last time. In that room, of course, there should be some water, maybe coffee as well for the coffee addicts, and obviously power sockets for charging stuff up, just in case they want to plug in their laptop or something. But definitely it's the being on your own that's very important in a speaker space. So if you have enough room to have a place where they can be without being disturbed, it's okay. If you have multiple speakers, they can share maybe the quiet space if you want, because generally other speakers will know to leave you alone. But it's better if there's a place sort of really, really calm. And this is one of the things I've often done when I'm going with a speaker to a big event, is I try and find out where are the safe places. Like, for example, there is one hotel in Stockholm where there is a door that leads out onto a roof. And I think most people use that for illicit smoking. But actually, I told one speaker, I said, if you can't get enough peace in the green room, just go out there on the roof and I will come and get you if necessary later. But that way you won't be disturbed and you can concentrate. And if you're doing a really, really big event, it can also help to offer extra services, like the yoga person we had at TEDx Stockholm. That was actually a big help. All the speakers I talked to said that helped them a lot. And one time also she turned up with a puppy dog, and that also was apparently
I remember the dog.
that was very popular. Everybody loved the dog.
Yeah.
And that helps as well. So it's good to have different spaces, maybe a quiet, relaxing space where people can be on their own with their thoughts, but also to have another place where there is either a very calm person who does the yoga things, or a puppy dog, or something anyway that lets people relax a little bit before they go out. Because nerves are actually a huge problem. And I've learned very often that you can make a speaker perform a lot better, not by telling them to do anything, but by fixing the surroundings so that they're less stressed. So like you see somebody who's obviously struggling with an uncomfortable headset microphone, but they're too polite to complain. I complain for them. I get the microphone guy and say, we've got to fix it so that this feels good, because I know how it is. It's like if you never worn a hat in your life and you suddenly have to wear a hat in front of a large audience, and you'd be afraid all the time, is it going to fall off my head? Or will it scratch or whatever? It's going to be really annoying. It's like when a dog gets a first collar for the first time, they feel uncomfortable. And most people are not used to wearing headset microphones. And they always have this sensation that it's about to fall off, or it squeezes their brain. And so instead of speaking, they're always thinking, oh no, I have this headset. And you can take away that stress completely just by removing it. So you can go around and identify all these sources of stress, take them away, and then the speaker performs a lot better. And once you've got the speaker calm and relaxed, then they start getting rid of all the other problems they had without being told. Like, for example, it's common for speakers to say, oh, everything's fine. I've got a lot of experience. I'm not afraid. But I sometimes forget what I'm saying. And I'm thinking, no, okay, you are nervous if you forget what you're saying. So, or they sometimes make filler noises as well, like ah, or whatever. And again, it's because they're nervous. Now, you could spend a lot of time teaching them techniques for getting rid of the fillers and techniques for avoiding the blackouts. But there's a much simpler way, and that is just to take away the source of stress, the source of nerves. They become more relaxed, and the noises go away by themselves. So it's actually, you can do a lot of, I don't have a name for this yet, the sort of light touch coaching where you're apparently not doing anything, but in fact, secretly, you're making it a lot easier. And that's actually a lot easier than yelling at people saying, your hand is at the wrong angle. You have spoken 180 words a minute instead of 170, and all of these things, which just make people stressed even more. It's like telling people to act natural or things like that. It just makes people more stiff. So I think that very often just making people calmer has a huge impact on the way they perform. So having a green room, if you have a space like that, is great. If you're in a building which is not actually a venue, you can find a meeting room somewhere and put a sign on the door, speakers only, keep out, and just let them be in there and just make sure that there's water, coffee, and maybe also a few snacks in case somebody somehow missed a meal and is maybe nervous because they're hungry, or maybe they just need a cake to calm down or something.
There are so many hacks when it comes to public speaking.
Yeah. This is something that every time I go to meet somebody at an event, I discover always a new thing. And then this is something I've been doing for a long time. And like once I went to San Francisco with a guy who was going to do an important speech at a conference. And he had never been on a big stage before. And the next day he had to go on a stage at a huge conference. And I thought, this is going to be difficult. So we went to the hotel the day before, and I had a quiet word with the people there. And I said, can we go into the room and try the stage, please? And they said, sure, no problem. So we actually went there, and I found where they were supposed to wait. We found the route they were supposed to take to the stage. And I made him walk up onto the stage, go up to the microphone, pause for a second, and start. And we did that a few times so that on the day when he actually did it, he was very, very relaxed and he'd seen, and there was no surprises. And I think that's very important. And I always do that myself. I always go and stand on the space, even if there's just 5 minutes, I use that time. And I always make my speakers go and stand on the stage. As soon as like at TEDx, for example, as soon as the letters and the carpet are in place, I run away, get my speakers, bring them back and say, okay, now you've got to stand there in the exact place just to feel what it's like, just so that there is no surprises. So there's this, you learn little things like that all the time, how to deal with the technical glitches and so on. And then the rest, I think it just comes with more experience, because eventually things will fail. The microphone will fail, the screen will fail, or whatever. And this is where it really gets interesting, is how you deal with difficulties. And this is, I think, another skill you have to learn, is how to stay calm when things are not working. And there's a lot of ways around that as well. One, for example, one very obvious one is not to rely on the tech. So like last year, I was at a certain university. I plug in everything and the screen doesn't work. The people are already in the room, ready for the lecture to start. So I just said, okay, I'll close the computer and I'll just do it unplugged. But I had prepared an unplugged version. I had in my pocket a card with keywords on it that I could use if I forgot. But I knew the thing well enough to do it with just a whiteboard. Now, if you know that you can talk without the screen, you don't care if it breaks. So this is why if you are reliant on technology for some reason, you're always going to be tense and nervous about that because it might break. But if you're not reliant, and if you always have a plan B, like if there's no screen, I will do like this. If there's no electricity, I will do like that. If there is an earthquake, I will do like this. If you have a plan for everything, then you don't care. And things happen, which they do, and you don't mind at all. And I mean, it does happen sometimes that you're there on stage and suddenly the lights go out because there's no electricity. And it's good to have an idea for what to do in these things. And then you are ready for everything. It gradually becomes easier, but I think with the right preparation, anybody can master that. But one of the most important tips, I think, is that you should always have a plan B for when the tech does fail you, because it will sooner or later. Don't rely on the microphone, don't rely on the projector, don't rely on the computer, but always have a plan B, both for when you're setting up, like I have a presentation in my laptop, I have a backup copy on a key in my pocket, I have another backup copy in my phone, which in a pinch, I could use that to screencast to the screen. And I also have a copy of the presentation in the cloud, so that if I lost everything, I could borrow a laptop, connect to the cloud, download a copy. But then if the projector breaks and there is no plan B, then you have to be able to talk without it. And I think everybody should always have that plan B. You should have the version. What will I say if I have no technology? What is my sort of minimum viable talk that can replace the presentation? And then what you will find, this is a completely different story, but what you will find then is that that minimum viable talk is actually a lot more effective than the big presentation with all the slides and the videos that you planned. And occasionally something will go wrong, you'll use the plan B and everybody will love it. And then maybe you're thinking, why do I even bother with all these PowerPoints? Which is another story, but
yeah. Andrea, I would love to see a book written by you about all these hacks. Are you not thinking about writing a book?
Yeah, I have two actually in progress at the moment, and they are both stuck for the same reason, that my thinking evolves faster than I can write it. So I wrote a book about speaking skills, but then I developed a whole new line of thinking about that. So now I have to rewrite the whole thing again. And I was hoping maybe last year that my sort of know-how would sort of stabilize a bit and sort of flatten off the curve, but it's not showing any sign of flattening off. I discover something very, very important every month, every week. So I'm a little bit stuck with that, and I'm not sure. Maybe I will do it in pieces and send out one piece at a time rather than waiting till it's all perfect. And I think that's maybe smaller fragments rather than the book is the way to go nowadays, because people, including me, tend not to read whole books. I mean, I would love to, and I keep buying them, but they don't get read. I think I will have to find smaller, more manageable morsels. So something between a full-length book and a TikTok, something that's digestible. And I think I have to maybe focus on one topic at a time, like maybe authentic speaking or lean speaking or whatever is the topic, and focus on that topic only. And that way people can maybe say, okay, now I want to learn how to have an unplugged plan B. And then they just read that. And then at the end, maybe I can collect all these pieces up and package them as a book. But I think that starting the thing as a book isn't going to be really the ideal. But that is something I'm working on, actually. And I've been working on that for years, and I have various drafts, but it's not ready yet for going out.
Okay, I'm waiting for the release, and going to be signed by you.
Thank you. I'll make sure you get one of the first ones.
Thank you so much. So we talked a lot about the hardware and when it comes to speaking. Tell me about the software. And what I mean now is like the management of the place, the people that's doing the service.
Well, I think that I have spoken in a lot of places, and in some places it's very easy because the staff understand what speakers want. And there are places where you're dealing with somebody maybe in a hotel who has never spoken. They have no empathy. They don't have any understanding of what it's like. So they don't understand that speakers before they start are very tense, and they want to see the thing and try a thing and be sure that everything's okay. They want a quiet place to think. They obviously don't have any experience of speaking, so they don't get that. And then there are other venues. Usually they're big places where you have a professional audiovisual team where things just work. And I've noticed that if you go to very, very big venues, this is especially true in the US, I think. If you walk onto the stage just to see how it feels, magically your microphone turns live because there's somebody in the control room. They see you and they turn on the microphone. So you don't need to say, can I have the microphone on, please? It's on for you. And they're watching. And I think that's really good. And it's good also when they come to you with plan B things and you don't have to say what happens if, because they have maybe the spare microphone standing by. In other occasions, I've had to arrange that, like when there's been a very, very important speech at the stock market in New York. On one occasion, I actually arranged for somebody to be sitting behind the speaker with another microphone just in case the first one broke. Whereas if it's a really, really important thing, you have two microphones just so that you're safe if something goes wrong. But in a really good place, the organizers know what people want. The things are there before you ask for them. And if you ask for things, they can manage it. Like, for example, at the last minute, you need a new pointer. They know where the nearest store is where you can get a pointer. So they can just tell you where it is, and they draw you a little map, and you can run around to Fry's or whatever it is and buy one. Or they have also lots of things like chargers for phones and laptops and things, and they take good care of you. But I think that in really professional venues like theaters, that tends to be more common. In hotels, it's not that common because there's a lot of people working there who don't have a background in speaking. But if you talk to the person who's in charge of the conference space, they tend to be a lot more expert. And also, if you then explain about your lighting needs, they can usually fix it. But the ideal place for me is one where you can just say, I'm going to stand here and I want light like that. And it just happens. And there are places like that. And it's a pleasure to work there, and where they've obviously thought of things like there is a room where you can be preparing before you go out, and you can test things, and that everything works okay. You never need to ask. And I think that's the ideal, which is why big venues with professional staff are always a lot easier than small hotels and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And all these are being done IRL, but now we are moving to online. How is the experience for you?
In the beginning, I was not so enthusiastic because part of the whole thing about having events is to meet people. And obviously, it's a lot easier to meet people in real life. I find also that it's a lot easier to speak in real life for various reasons. But you have to get used to the virtual thing. And I think that it does actually have some small advantages. The main one being that you get a different audience. Like if you have a 6 p.m. talk at Impact Hub Stockholm, you get the people who maybe worked all day and they have a little bit of time in the evening, but you don't get people with small children. This is just the way it is. If you have a breakfast meeting, you get almost everybody except me, because I don't like breakfast meetings. I'm not a morning person. And you tend to get an audience depending on the physical place and the time and everything. If it's online, anybody can join in. And they can also maybe catch up later with the recording if they want. You have more difficulty with the interactions for obvious reasons, but I think that people are getting better at that. I just did a workshop yesterday which had a lot of audience interactivity, and it worked okay using just standard Zoom. And I think also people now are getting better at having a space, a microphone, the right lighting, the right arrangement of things, and having a clear background and things. That has definitely improved a lot, though not everybody mastered that yet. Like, for example, there's one very, very simple hack to look better in a Zoom call, and that is to raise up your laptop or phone to the height of your eyes, so that the camera is at the height of your eyes. You need a big pile of boxes. You just take any old box or something. You can do that very easily, but still a lot of people are leaning and bending over a laptop, and it looks, it doesn't look very professional, and it looks a little bit creepy sometimes. And then a lot of people have a bright light behind them, so you see a lot of light, but their face is in darkness. That's also not ideal. And I think there's a lot of people still have problems with internet connections, which is unfortunate. I do something from home where I always test the connection first, and it's fast enough now. We've upgraded. But in the office, I mean, I get from 80 to 280 megabits per second when I test before I think, so there's never a glitch at all, which is one reason for using the co-working space for these live workshops. But I think that people have learned a lot over the last few years, and I think that we will continue in the future to have a mixture of real life and virtual. So I think that this kind of Zoom event will have a space, and people are getting cleverer at making it more interesting, more fun and everything than they used to be. And people maybe who are growing up using these things will find it a lot easier than people who've never done it. And I recall when I think it was the first SARS epidemic, when there was traveling was suspended, and I remember that Where I worked, we were all ordered not to travel to Asia, but to use video conference instead. And most people were not used to video conference at all in those days. So we would spend most of the time just giggling and laughing because it was so much fun. And we didn't really get a lot of work done. Now, though, everybody's grown up with Skype and FaceTime, and they don't really have a problem with video calls anymore. And for young people, especially who were born with these things, I mean, it's just the normal way to communicate. So they're a lot less nervous. And other people in the beginning tended to have their camera off, which is not good. Even if you're just the audience and just listening, I want to see you. And this has always been a problem because long before we had the pandemic, there would be cases where I would be doing a remote lecture at a university which didn't want to pay for the travel expenses. So I'd be in Stockholm with my camera on a big pile of boxes, although I do have a new tripod now to use instead of the boxes, a couple of lights, various other things, and I'm talking, and in some big lecture theatre in some university on the other side of the world, there's hundreds of students all sitting watching me, but I don't see their reaction, which is very, very bad, because if you don't see the reaction, you don't get the feedback you get from a normal class. Even if they say nothing, you can tell from the face if it's too fast, too slow, if they understand, or if you're not clear, or if they are not excited. So you can adapt the content depending on the faces they make. And when you see a lot of question mark faces, you know that you have to explain more and so on. So what I tend to do now is I ask people, I find one person at the other end and I say, okay, open up a one-to-one video call with your phone to my phone, point your phone at the audience, and then I will have in front of me, next to my camera, I will have my phone where I can see the audience. Or if you have a big screen, you can use that. And I've also, to make it easier for me to look straight ahead at this camera all the time, what I sometimes do is I put a big laptop behind the camera. I have a Twitter page search for my name there, zoomed in 200% or something. And I tell people if they have a question to send it through Twitter. That way, as I can be looking at the camera straight in the eye of the students and reading the questions at the same time. Because if they send it through Zoom or something, then you have to then look down to see what they're saying. And that doesn't look good when somebody is doing a lecture and suddenly they bend over and look down and look at the screen. That doesn't look professional at all. The ideal is the speaker is standing up. They are speaking like they would in a normal speaking situation, because this standing up is actually more important than people realize. I didn't discover that until I went to a place where people sat down, but I'll explain that in a moment. But having a good setup like that where you do get feedback from the audience is very important. And if you are going to be in a Zoom call, you should always have your video on, except maybe when you have to do something with a cat or something. And also have your real name, not your game name, because I don't know your gamer name. So it's a lot easier for me if you write your real name, not just initials or whatever other names you use online. Put your real name, and it makes it a lot easier. And if it's an audience in a big room but remote, then you really need to have a monitor showing what the audience looks like. If you had a big screen in a room, meeting room, you could use that as well. I would love to do that, to have a huge screen where I can see the audience almost life size, and then have my camera and lights and everything, and another screen behind me, or a green screen for the slides. And I think ultimately we will end up in situations where most people have that kind of setup, because they will be doing remote lectures. But then you have the possibility of doing a lecture in Tokyo one day, or maybe the same day then do another one in Washington. And that, I think, will be very interesting. We will still need face-to-face events because that's very important, but I think that we need to get used to doing virtual things. So I still always prefer the real life, because then I meet the people, and that's one of the great things about being a speaker, is you get a very strong network, because if you go to an event, you don't remember the other people who were just there. You remember the speakers, the moderators, and maybe the organizer, but that's it.
Yeah. And you're in touch with many speakers. What do they want? Keep doing it digitally, or they want to be on the stage?
I think the majority of people want to go back to real life. I think that they enjoy that much more. It's a lot more fun, and in many ways, it's a lot easier too. And you have also one less stress. I mentioned before that I tend to prefer not to have any PowerPoints or anything, because then you don't worry about it not working. You don't worry about forgetting which order the slides are. You don't worry about the clicker battery running out or anything. With a virtual show, you always have the worry that the Zoom could crash, Zoom has failed. The whole service has been down many times. So you have to have a plan B account. It could be that your camera breaks. It could be that you didn't plug in your power adapter completely and the battery runs down and your computer suddenly stops halfway through the show. And it can always happen that your microphone is on mute and you don't know it. And everybody's waving at you and you don't realize that it's because they can't hear you. That happens a lot. So it's an additional stress. And a lot of people don't like being on their own in a little room. And this is something that came up only this year, that I used to get a lot of people who would come and say, help, I have to speak in front of a large audience. I am terrified. How do I deal with that? Now I'm getting people coming to me saying, help, I have to speak in an empty room. I'm terrified. How do I cope with the lack of people? Now, if you do a very big event, then you do have maybe 10, 20 engineer technicians there anyway, and coaches and other people. But very often when I do a lecture on my own, it's just me in the room. And that means that I have to try to imagine the audience and I don't get the feedback, and it's not so comfortable just looking at the camera all the time. And you have to imagine there being people there. Some people actually put a picture of a person next to the camera to make it, or they get a friend to sit under the camera so that it feels more human-like. And if possible, you should try and get a studio audience, even if it's just family or pets or something. And that's why TV studios always have studio audiences. It's not for the public or for them, it's for the performers, especially if you're trying to do something funny. It's very hard to be funny in an empty room. That's insanely difficult. And I've been part of a TV audience once, and we were never shown on camera. And they explained before we started, you guys here are just to make the guys on the set feel good, because they're going to try and say funny things. And if you don't laugh, then they're going to feel very, very uncomfortable. And that was the instruction. If we say something funny, laugh. If we don't. And that was all we had to do. And,
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So tell me, can we apply the same principles outdoor? Because I'm working a lot with urban design.
This is something that I think that we need to think about. It's not mainstream to do outdoor events for various reasons, but it's something that we maybe need to look back on, because it was something that happened in the olden days, like in medieval Italy, for example. Every medieval city had a building called an arengario, which is the place with a big sort of elevated balcony where you could speak to the public. You had to have that because there was no radio, there was no TV, there was no social media, there was no TikTok. So if the king wanted to do a little TikTok dance for the people, he would have to go to the arengario, and the people would fill the stage in front of it and so on. If you go to Milan today, on the south side of Piazza del Duomo, there is still an arengario. It was actually built in the fascist era, actually. But they still build these things. They don't usually use them, though. But I wonder sometimes if maybe we could plan for emergencies. And there was another case in the 1600s in England. There was a big plague in London. And there was a little village in Derbyshire called Eyam, which is famous for its plague cottages and everything. And apparently the local tailor ordered some cloth from London. Inside the cloth were some fleas. The fleas had the plague. And suddenly the people in this village started to get sick. So the legend is that they decided to self-isolate. They decided they would stay there and not spread the infection. The truth is that the rich people ran away and left the poor people there to die. But the local village, the surrounding villages would leave food and other things on the roads going in, so the people stayed there. And then the local priest thought, oh, well, we really have to pray the pandemic away, but we can't use the church because then we will all get sick. So they chose a bowl-shaped piece of land outside the village, and they would have the church services there, with every family group standing 2 meters apart so that they wouldn't cross-infect each other. Now, they just used a natural sort of ball-shaped space there, but I'm wondering if we could maybe not also look in terms of spaces to be used in rare cases. Like, for example, when you build any structure, normally a bridge or something, you plan for the 100-year storm, the 100-year flood, the earthquake, and things that don't happen very often. Or if you build a kind of a campus where there's no vehicles, you still have to have roads for the fire trucks. Even if nobody maybe ever goes on those roads, they have to be there. So you have some things which are planned that might never be used. So whereas normally you would think, I'm going to build a speaking space and it's very important, therefore I give up a lot of my space for that. But you could maybe build in speaking sort of spaces as a kind of side effect in other things, like you build a big lobby, but if while you're building it, you ask, could we get all of the people in the building into this lobby? And is there a place where somebody could speak from? It could be a stair, case of something or whatever. It doesn't need to be something that's only for speaking. It can be multi-purpose. So you could have that indoors or even outdoors. And I see already some people do this to a certain extent. Like, for example, at the SpaceX facility in Hawthorne in California, you'll notice that their mission control has got a glass wall. And behind it is the factory. And what happens is that normally you have the people in mission control and a couple of people pressing their noses against the glass outside to see what's happening. When there's a very, very important launch, all the employees gather around to watch. And I'm guessing that somebody's thinking ahead. Elon Musk has probably been thinking about the day when he steps onto Mars, and everybody will want to see. So the mission control, the NASA mission control in Houston has got a glass wall room for VIPs behind the mission control, but it's very small. Elon Musk's thing is to have the mission control built into the factory with a glass wall and a huge space behind. So literally you could have thousands of people there watching. And I guess that there will be times when that actually happens. So you could build a big campus, a big building or something, and think, okay, in an emergency, or if we wanted, we could use this space for events or for a message to everybody. Or you could even think, when we're landscaping the outside, could we make a thing like the famous depression in Eam, the Cucket's I think it's called, which is optimized for having an audience outdoors and having a speaking thing. It could be that you could use it in emergencies, or it could be that maybe in good weather you could say, "Oh, we're going to have an outdoor TED or something." You could use that space occasionally. It doesn't need to be very often, or use it for concerts. But it could be one of those things where you say, "Could we make a small change that would make this space usable when it's needed?" Just like the way you build in various emergency things which you hope you'll never use, like the fire lanes. Very often the building is built, it's used, and then it's finally demolished, with the fire lanes never ever being used by a fire truck, but you still have to have them. And you could also design a big space inside or outside, which has other purposes. It could be a lobby, it could be an eating place, it could be whatever. And you say this part space then will be used in an emergency for whatever it is. Just like, for example, the old Katarina Berry parking garage is actually a H-bomb shelter, and it's been used since the 1950s for parking cars. Now it's closed for the rebuilding work, but I've parked there. And at once I was wondering, why did they blast this huge parking garage in the side of a mountain? But the real reason is that it's the H-bomb shelter. And in an emergency, they push the cars out, they install 10,000 beds, and you have a shelter where the people of Stockholm can shelter. So you have this kind of dual use. You have a kind of peacetime use, which is for parking, and then you have the emergency use, which is for sheltering. And I think you could do the same with some large spaces. So if I was building a big campus for a big company or a hospital or something, I'd be asking, maybe, is there some place indoors or outdoors or both that with a few small changes could be usable for speaking? And it's not as challenging as it used to be in the days of the Arangari, because then you had no microphones. Now you can be pretty safe, sure that you will have amplification. Somebody with a battery-powered bullhorn, for example, could easily speak to a large crowd of people. And there was a time when I would have said, you need to have power sockets and network sockets and microphone sockets. You don't need that anymore. You can do everything through wireless, so people can have a wireless headset. So you just need to have all of the microphone receivers or a space for them inside the building. And you don't really need electricity either, because there's a lot of battery-powered lighting rigs nowadays with LED lights and a big battery pack. I've seen increasingly when they're doing movie shoots, they used to always go around with the generator truck and then a lot of big HMI lights. Now very often you see a guy brings along a LED light on the stand and then hooks a huge battery pack on it, and there's no cables anymore. And I think that means that you don't need to have the hidden sort of plugs and sockets board out on the balcony or the terrace or your Arangari or whatever you want. You could just physically have a space, try and make it so that the sight lines are okay and things like that, but you don't need to worry so much about the acoustics. You don't need to worry so much about the wind, which used to be a big thing, and you don't need to plan lots of hidden power sockets and things like that.
Yeah. Where do you like to give a speech? Indoor or outdoor?
Well, in normal conditions, it's easier indoors, because the problem outdoors is you are relying on the weather conditions and especially the wind, which can blow the sound away, which means that it can be very difficult. But it is actually nice when the weather is good and the air is calm. It's nice actually to be outside, especially if you have a natural kind of amphitheater, a natural kind of space for speaking. And it's good sometimes to speak in a garden or some other environment like that. It's really nice. It's a very different audio ambient because you don't get usually the same kind of echoes and things, but it does give you a bit more fresh air and it feels more open. And it's really nice, I find, to have a very high ceiling. And of course, the outside is the highest ceiling you can get. And that's really good. You get this feeling of being very open. And I think that where it would be really nice to speak is in one of these venues out in the desert in Colorado or Arizona. There are some places out there in resorts where there is an outdoor space, which is a beautiful place for speaking. And you go to any of the big sort of resorts in that part of the USA and you'll find that there are already a lot of good outdoor spaces. And you wait till nighttime, maybe in the wintertime, like in December in Arizona, it's warm in the evening, so you're not going to freeze. The sky is very clear because the air is dry. You've got the stars, you've got various other things flying around, and it's very inspiring to be out there in the evening.
Yeah. And Andrea, if you take the time machine and go back in time, it's called Urbanistica time machine, and then you're allowed to change one thing related to spaces and speaking, what will you change?
There is two things I would like to change. The first one is I wish that people would build rooms with higher ceilings. One of the most annoying things is in some hotels and some offices, the ceiling is very, very low, which means that you have a projector which is only just above your head, which means that it's always shining in your eyes. And this low ceiling makes everything difficult. It's difficult to put lights in. It's difficult to have a sort of feeling of being in the open. It's difficult to manage the projectors. Everything it's like you're on a submarine or on the lower decks of a ship. It's very uncomfortable and claustrophobic. That I don't like. And I think the other is I would like to have been in the meeting where they decided to make PowerPoint and try to make it a little bit more speaker friendly. That would be another, one of my sort of ideal universes is where the person who invented PowerPoint suddenly has last minute rethink and decides not to bother, and then speaking improves dramatically. But that's another thing. I think the ceilings there is something that we could do a lot. And I've noticed that when a lot of old buildings are refurbished, they often take out the hanging ceiling and just leave the plumbing open to the air. And it actually improves it a lot because then the effective ceiling height goes up. And I understand that some buildings have got very low ceilings, and I don't like that. I think you should have, especially for rooms for presentations and things there, you really have to have them in a space where the ceiling is high. I think it's very, very lazy to have it in an office space with low ceilings. And I'm not even sure that having office spaces with very low ceilings is a great idea either. I think it makes people feel that they're being pushed down or something. I would be interested to see if anybody's done any research on that to see whether the motivation of people is better or worse in rooms with higher ceilings and lower ceilings. But I have noticed, though, that anecdotally, I've seen the effect of when people move from a bad environment to a good environment, their behavior changes. Like, for example, in Milan, when I lived there, every so often I would have to go to the questura to get my residence permit renewed. In the old building, which was a horrible medieval thing and just full of mountains of archives and really, really dysfunctional, the staff were always grumpy and unfriendly, and it was really not a pleasure to go there. Then they moved to a new building, the passport building, and suddenly everybody's very kind, like they show you how to use the copier. You don't have a coin for the copier, no problem, I'll pay for it for you. And the change in the sort of behavior of the employees was extraordinary. But I've seen that in other cases as well. You take people from a low ceiling, dark place with no windows, and you put them in somewhere with a high ceiling and big windows, and they suddenly start behaving a lot better to each other.
Yeah. And actually, this is also the point of Urbanistica podcast, is to host people that not really working with architecture or urban planning to get to understand how do they experience the thing that we produce.
Yes.
So I'm really happy that you were here and sharing with us all your experiences. Thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
So if you take the same time machine and go the future, what will you add?
Well, we're a little bit, we're not going to have a clear vision of what kind of technology we could have because nobody anticipated the technology we have today, even 10 years ago. Like even in 2010, we didn't really anticipate the impact that social media would have. And I think that shows that we probably don't know what's going to happen next. But what I'm hoping is that we get away from the screen-based sort of presentations and people get more into talking about what they want to talk about. And I think that that will mean maybe backing off from the fancy PowerPoint tools and things, and maybe getting better at speaking instead. Because I think tools like PowerPoint are very helpful for somebody who's not very good at presenting to get from zero to usable. But if you want to get beyond that, it's a little bit like the stabilizing wheels on a child's bicycle. At the beginning, it's a big help, but then it holds you back. And I think that's moving forward. I'm hoping that people get better at doing talks and things without any help. And you look, there's lots of people who do great talks like Greta Thunberg without ever using a single slide. The PowerPoint is not necessary. And also, I'm seeing now some companies are discouraging it finally, like companies like Klarna, where they have short meetings. They try to limit the time and they discourage slides in internal meetings. You don't really need them. And that gives you a massive productivity improvement because a lot of employees spend too much of their time just making slides. That's one of the big drawbacks. It makes the meetings heavier and it wastes a lot of time before and after. So if we could get people more used to identifying what their message is and communicating that, using appropriate technology, but not being slaves to a linear presentation sequence. So I can see people using a lot more live video, augmented reality and things like that, but a lot less linear slide presentations.
Yeah. So what is the next step for you going to be?
Good question, because there is always something new just around the corner, and I'm looking at a lot of different topics right now. One is my approach to coaching, where it's a relatively light touch, where I don't look at the little mistakes, but instead I look at what's causing the little mistakes and fix that. That I want to develop further. Everything is sort of like work in progress. That's still not fully developed 100%. It works. It's what I've been doing for years, but I want to develop that a little bit further. And also I want to sort of like look ahead to where we're going to be in the future and start moving there already. Like there's the clear trend to shorter things. There's a clear trend towards less linear things. And I think as well that we will probably see more innovation in the spaces for speaking as well. The classic meeting room has its purpose, and there are actually a lot of conventions and traditions that people are not totally aware of. Like, for example, the reason why the speaker stands at the head of the table and stands up to speak is to show who's speaking. I only realized that was very important when I went to a company once where everybody just sat down and you couldn't tell who was the speaker. And I realized that, I'm used to the speaker who's speaking, signaling that by standing up. And you see this is throughout human history, there's been various ways of signaling that. And sometimes it's by holding something, like there are some hunter-gatherer tribes where every so often the whole tribe meets to discuss where to move their homes to or something. And only one person can speak at a time, but that person is given a big stick. So the guy with the stick is the speaker, and anybody who wants to speak, they ask for that. So they have that kind of signaling system, and we have standing up at the head of the table and holding the clicker or the big pointing stick or whatever. Those are our symbols. And in more formal environments, you have other things like, for example, spaces like governments and parliaments. They tend to have special sort of lecterns for the person who's speaking, or in parliaments like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the government and the opposition speakers have a special box. It's an old messaging box, a dispatch box, which is an antique box full of Bibles or something. And when it's their turn to speak, they stand at their box, put their papers on the box, and that signals to everybody, I am speaking for the opposition or I am speaking for the government. And I think that we need to evolve new spaces where we have a sort of clear structure like that, but without necessarily having the boardroom table, maybe more comfortable sort of things. But we still need to have some kind of ritual, some kind of symbolism to show who's got the word and should just be listening and so on. But I think we'll see probably some evolution in that when we move away a little bit from being chained to the screen. Like, for example, if you don't need a screen, you can stand at either end, which means you're not stuck in the worst end of the room. You could be somewhere else. It also means you could make rooms in a different shape. I have tried a few rooms which are not rectangular, and some work okay, some don't. There's one where I've spoken many times, which it feels like a nightclub because it's a strange sort of layout with big steps. But it's not exactly the right solution, I think. But I'd love to try experimentally to maybe build some temporary rooms of different shapes and sizes and see what impact that has on the way people speak. And when we move away from having a fixed screen and a projector screwed to the ceiling, we'll be more free to do these things. And I also want to see what happens with people who've literally grown up working at a distance. So, for example, people who were born in since 2000, for example, they've been more or less born having tools like Skype and FaceTime and everything. So for them, being constantly connected to other people is the norm rather than being exceptional. And I've seen some companies have been experimenting with always-on video conferencing. So like you have a corner or a room where there's a camera and a big screen connected to another site, and you just walk in and sit down and start talking, and you're already on. And I think that is something that teenagers can easily relate to because they are often permanently connected to their friends. So I think that we will see maybe a blurring of the lines between people just doing normal work and people meetings, and that will be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, very interesting reflections. Thank you so much again, and I wish you all the good luck with your project and with your experimentation.
Thank you very much.
Apart of this, what are your hobbies? Apart from writing, reading, coaching?
Okay, right now I think that the two things I work on the most are, of course, TEDx Stockholm and learning Swedish, which is it sucks up a lot of my time. I'm hoping that when that's got to the point where I can do lectures comfortably in Swedish, then I can start looking for a new hobby again. And one thing that probably I want to do more of is more work restoring our old little stuga in Småland. It's an old house from the 1800s. I'd love to do more of the carpentry work on that and bring it back to the standard it was when it was built. And also I'm hoping to discover something completely new. That you never know what's around the next corner. And so I'm just waiting till we get there, and think I will probably find some new hobby that I could never have imagined 10 years ago. And maybe things that don't exist yet. And I will try that.
Yeah. And why you don't want to give a TEDx talk?
I think the real problem there is that my thinking evolves very quickly, which means that I have an idea. But by the time I pitched it, I moved on to a new idea. So I have a lot of ideas, and eventually one will happen. But I'm not quite there yet. I would like something also based on some result as well, not just an idea, but something that I've tested. And I have a lot of ideas for doing that, but not had enough time yet to actually test them in the field. But I do have a big folder full of ideas. I have a lot of outlines, and I will do that eventually. Though for obvious conflict of interest reasons, it won't be done in Stockholm. But I will do that eventually, and maybe also I will try and find something completely new to talk about that I've never talked about before. That I think would be an interesting challenge.
Yeah.
Not to say anything where people would say, oh, I've heard that before. I want people to think, holy shit, I never thought you'd talk about that.
Yeah.
So I have my plans, and it will come.
Nice. Looking forward. So thank you so much again, Andrew. And how would you like to summarize what we talked about, your reflections, and 3 takeaway messages to all the listeners? Okay,
3 takeaway messages. I think the first is that you have to take into account the conditions that the speaker is working in, whether it's the space or whatever. If you have a company that has meeting rooms, or you organize an event or whatever, if you take good care of the speaker spaces, the speakers perform better and you benefit as well. Everybody benefits. The second thing is that I think that if you are a speaker, you have to be brave enough to go in and say, I don't like that light shining in my eye. Can we move it, please? Or say, I'd like to have a table here. So you go in, you don't like the setup, you change it. And I've done that once in the US. I remember I went into a room, and it was a very, very long room, and they'd set up the podium in the middle of one of the long sides. And I thought you would have to twist your neck to see the people at the extremes. So I said, no, we've got to move the podium to one of the corners, please. That wasn't for me. I wasn't the speaker, but I knew the speaker, and I thought he's going to be uncomfortable in this position. So I said, we move everything. And of course, being the US, you just give the order and then people run and do it. So they did. They moved the whole stage, the microphones and everything just for me. So you have to be brave and say, I don't like it like this. Let's fix it. And finally, I think in general, you have to understand that you are not going to perform well if there's something that makes you uncomfortable. So you have to think, okay, instead of thinking, oh, I'm nervous, how can I work around that using techniques and other little tricks to hide the nerves or whatever, you have to try and understand, what is it that's making me nervous? Is it that I'm too far away from the audience? Is it that I'm too close? Is it that there's a table in a way, or that there isn't a table? Or is it that I'm worried about things breaking? And then when you've figured out what it is that's worrying you, you take that worry away and then you feel relaxed. Like, for example, for a lot of people, the tech breaking is the biggest fear. They're worried what happens if it doesn't work. Well, the easiest way to fix that is just to take a card, write down some key points and have that in your pocket. In the worst case, you can just look at the card. Nobody will complain about that. But you do an unplugged version. And if you have an unplugged version, nothing ever breaks. It only ever happened to me once that I actually needed to do that. But then it gives you the possibility to do what I did on Tuesday, where I asked the audience, I said, would you like PowerPoint or unplugged? And they all said, unplugged, please. So I just closed the computer, turned off the projector, and just talked. So you have that choice if you have a plan B. So you need to be aware that your feelings, your stress impacts the way you speak. And the easiest way to fix that is not to think, how can I hide that? How can I make it not look like I'm nervous? The easiest way is to find out what it is and to take away all those things so that you do literally walk onto the stage without a care in the world. And you don't care even if an earthquake comes, you think, I'm going to be okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
You're
now,
welcome.
3 hashtags for the episode.
3 hashtags, I would probably say something like be prepared, be relaxed, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
You're welcome.
So thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast season number 2. I hope you enjoyed the episode, learned something new and got inspired by the guest. And also please don't forget to share the episode with your friends, colleagues and people you think they are interested in Urbanistica topic. Follow on Instagram account, you will see the stories behind the scenes before and after every episode we record in the podcast. And also don't forget to subscribe the YouTube channel to see the live talks and also to see the vlogs. If you have any feedback or you want to suggest a new topic or nominate a new guest, you can just reach out and write me. You can find me everywhere: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and also my email. So feel free to write me and share your thoughts with me. Thank you so much again for listening. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.